while the German Eastern Front, beginning in May 1942, began a large-scale offensive in the south, moving to the Caucasus and the Volga, and the 16th Army fought exhausting battles over the cauldron at Demyansk. The 18th Army went completely into position warfare. Even after the fighting was over, life did not get any better for the troops in these positions. They constantly had to first equip and then reinforce them. Infantry, sappers, artillery observers and anti-tank artillery were constantly positioned in close proximity to the enemy, exposing themselves to snipers, machine gunners, mortars, katyushas and artillery fire. Attacks by German units and enemy counterattacks succeeded each other. It was not always possible to dig trenches and dugouts at the positions. On the Volkhov River and in the Pogostievskoye cauldron, groundwater in many places did not allow for excavation, so it was necessary to use logs and log bunkers, as well as log decks. Wehrmacht reports did not talk much about this front. It remained in the shadows, although even here the troops made many casualties every day. For example, in the war diary of the 284th Infantry Regiment of the 96th Infantry Division in August 1942, it was recorded that without special fighting, the number of dead and wounded amounted to 12% of all personnel. The command needed to restore the full strength of divisions and regiments by disbanding mixed combat groups and conducting mass troop movements. Almost all divisions were engaged at the front, so all these measures were delayed until August. The organization of supply of troops was created from the beginning of winter 1941 from the front line, to the rear and further up to the borders of the Reich. The implementation of this operation was the responsibility of the rear guard chief of the 18th Army and his staff, the commander of the guard units of the front area, General von Roch, with his guard divisions 207th, 281st and 285th, with the help of field and local commandants' offices and many other services. Through the divisional medical stations and field infirmaries moved a stream of wounded and sick by car in temporary or fully equipped sanitary trains bound for the infirmaries of the Baltic states and Germany. In especially severe cases, when urgent surgery was required, airplanes with the wounded flew from the territory of bridgeheads. Most divisions equipped for themselves rest homes in those Baltic countries where the population was friendly and helpful to the Germans. Such rest homes existed on the Riga seashore, Revel, Felin, Toila, Veritsa, and in some other places. The only service in them was eating and sleeping, where the long-standing soldiers' wish could be realized more music and less bosses. The nurses who worked in these rest homes earned the sincere gratitude of the soldiers for their care. Already in the first winter the horses were sent to the rear, where the possibilities for feeding them were better, as far as Estonia and Latvia on both sides of the Western Divina. Many horses died from lack of fodder and cold. Volunteers, partly from the Baltic countries, partly from defectors and prisoners of war, were increasingly appearing in the wagons and supply units, which made it possible to release soldiers and send them to the front. The railroad lines provided transportation of food, ammunition, fuel, field mail, and all kinds of supplies, as well as wounded men, containers and equipment in need of repair. Regular trains carrying vacationers were very important to the soldiers, and a strict Platzkart system ensured that vacationers were distributed fairly among the echelons. German Railways railroaders in blue uniforms accompanied the trains with a sense of duty and fearlessness, both through areas dotted with partisan units and through areas that could be attacked from the air. Construction units, which also included prisoners of war, were engaged in building and repairing roads, bridges, log decks, and field railroads. Numerous depots for food, ammunition, fuel, and clothing were built in the rear areas of the army, as well as parks for storing military, engineering and sanitary equipment, and spare parts for communications and sanitation vehicles. There were also repair shops, bakeries, slaughterhouses, dairy farms, laundries, bathhouses, pest control rooms, soldiers' clubs, and many other services. Sawmills utilized the nation's timber reserves to furnish positions and build cantonments. Branched wire networks of communications troops and radio networks provided telephone, telegraph, and radio communications. Security divisions, as well as Estonian and Latvian police units, guarded the rear areas against partisan raids, the activities of which caused serious disturbances, especially from 1943 onward, though not to such an alarming extent as in the area of the 16th Army and Army Group Centre. All these numerous tasks, which fell within the competence of the Chief of Army Logistics in the territory between the Volkhov and Leningrad, were an integral part of the combat operations of the troops and a prerequisite for their success. It is also necessary to mention the measures on administrative management in the occupied areas and provision of the population with food. In addition, the German command was still taking preparatory measures for the offensive against Leningrad, the main blow of which was to be carried out by the 11th Army under the command of Field Marshal Manstein, who had endured a severe test in the struggle for Sevastopol. Its divisions and siege artillery were transported from the Crimea to Ingermanland. The forces that could be better utilized during the offensive in the Caucasus and Stalingrad were to carry out an operation that had been aborted back in September 1941, when it was still easy to carry it out, and for which there was no operational necessity at the moment. Without any doubt, this was again a mistaken decision by Hitler, as became clear a few months later at Stalingrad. This offensive, codenamed Northern Lights, was to begin on September 14th and was to go through the Neva River, bypassing the city, as the German command wanted to avoid street fighting, which caused heavy casualties. As a result of the operation, the city was to be completely isolated and subsequently captured. After the unsuccessful offensive on the Volkhov, the Soviet command began to set itself more modest goals. It no longer sought to destroy the entire 18th Army by striking in the direction of Yamburg-Narva, to destroy the Volkhov front by bilateral coverage of Luban, but hoped that as a result of a strike through the railway junction MGA along the Kirov Railroad to the Neva River at the mouth of the Tosna River will be restored land connection with Leningrad. MGA at the base of the Schlisselburg bottleneck remained for the next year and a half the goal of the Soviet command. It reasonably expected the Germans to realize their plans for an attack on Leningrad after the 11th Army had taken Sevastopol in heavy fighting and gained rich experience in fighting in a fortified area. On the Karishi bridgehead, which was mainly the fiefdom of the East Prussian divisions, it was turbulent throughout the summer, constantly having to repel Russian attacks. At Gruzin and on the Russian bridgeheads west of the Volkhov, local fighting was again occurring. According to the plans of the Soviet command, Karishi was to be the prelude to the mass use of heavy weapons. 3 regiments of artillery, 4 tank brigades together with units of the VI Guards Rifle Corps unleashed their attack on several battalions of the 11th and 21st Infantry Divisions, alternating with each other. The battle, which began on June 5, 1942, reached its climax between July 21st and August 2nd. When the fighting subsided on August 20th, the entire bridgehead was riddled with craters, 171 enemy tanks were destroyed, most of them in close combat. For the Soviet command, Karishi was only a preliminary preparation for the planned summer offensive. On the eve of the first battle on Lake Ladoga, after the regrouping of corps and the arrival of the 1st Headquarters and divisions from the Crimea, the 18th Army had the following balance of forces on August 23rd. On the Volkhov River in the northern direction from Novgorod, on both sides of Moskov and near the railroad was XXXV I Army Corps, consisting of the 20th Motorized Division and 212th Division. Adjoining them was the I Army Corps 254, 291, 1st and 61st Infantry Divisions, now holding a bridgehead near Gruzin. On the Karishi bridgehead and around the Pogostievsko cauldron was located XXV I Army Corps 269, 21, 1193, 217 and 96th Infantry Divisions. The eastern and northern sections of the front at the bottleneck were defended by the XXVI Army Corps with its 223rd and 227th Infantry Divisions. On the Leningrad front from the middle reaches of the Neva River to Yuritskes was the L Army Corps with the SS Polizei Division, the 121st Infantry Division, the 2nd SS Infantry Brigade, and the 215th Infantry Division. Positions around the Iranian-bomb cauldron were held by the 58th and 225th Infantry Divisions. The 250th Spanish Division was withdrawn from the Novgorod section of the front to replace the 121st Infantry Division at Kolpin. The 12th Panzer Division was replenished in the rear of the army. The 5th Mountain Division was also at the disposal of the 18th Army. From the Crimea were delivered headquarters of the XXX and Liv Army Corps, the 24th and 170th Infantry Divisions. This was the first echelon of compounds intended for the offensive against Leningrad. Artillery Commander Harko had been in charge of the artillery offensive on Leningrad since the fall of 1941. His task now included ground and air reconnaissance of enemy defences and engineering preparation of positions of all types of artillery, including siege artillery, organisation of ammunition supply, etc. In the midst of all the German preparations, the Russians launched an offensive in the direction of MGA. The Soviet command made up with new forces the losses of the 2nd Shock Army and 54th Army defeated during the Battle of Volkhov, for which purpose they used marching battalions, penalty officers, and unreliable Turkic tribes. They underwent an accelerated course of military training, so that, despite the German offensive on the southern front, they would be able to fight offensive battles here in the north. Fighting broke out first on the Leningrad front, where in the last third of July and the first third of August, the defending divisions had to repel powerful Russian attacks, or repel their units through counterattacks near Yuritsk and south of Kolpin. Between Pushkin and Yuritskoye, along with the 215th Division and the SS Polizei Division, parts of the 12th Panzer Division, as well as the Flemish, Dutch and Norwegians of the Eicheln Group, took part in the fighting. From August 18th to September 4th, heavy defensive battles east of Kolpin once again broke out, but a serious threat to the blockade ring had not yet come. In fact, all the described attacks served simply as a camouflage of preparatory measures for the offensive organised on the Kirov Railroad road. Here the headquarters of the Volkhov front brought 16 infantry divisions, 9 brigades and 300 tanks to combat readiness. The first battle on Ladoga began on August 27th, and by October 2nd led to complete success during the defensive fighting, although it was not without crises. From the Kirov Railroad, on both sides of Tortolov and Gaitolov to a large peat bog north of Sinyavin, after a powerful artillery and mortar preparation, and with the support of aviation rolled a wave of Russian offensive on the weak line of German defences. At first the enemy managed to break through only at the power line Sagebrush and Workers' Village No. 8. The weak forces of the 223rd and 227th Divisions could not, of course, long resist such attacks. On both sides of the power line, the defence line was broken west of Gaitolov, and the enemy advanced westward through difficult, wooded terrain. The 170th Division was quickly transferred by rail to MGA, and already on August 28th was put into action to block the breakthrough area, with its equipment on its southern flank north of the Kirov Railroad from the western outskirts of Tortolov to the area northeast of MGA. Its units were preparing to defend the Sinyavinsky Heights. And again, as during the Volkhov battle, the decisive factor was the fact that at the site of the breakthrough resisted by 2 flanks in the south, near Tortolov, and in the north near Gontova, where a specially distinguished 366th Infantry Regiment, which, despite the encirclement, steadfastly held on, the regiment was commanded by Colonel Wingler. Thus, in the hands of the Russians remained only one way to supply all their units, namely the route of the power line. And yet the Russians managed to reach the road on which the supply of German troops was carried out, and thus pass halfway to the Neva. There was a situation which could not be eliminated by their own forces. On the first day of the battlefield, Marshal Manstein, together with the staff of the 11th Army, arrived in Ushaiki. For Colonel General Lindemann, it meant that he was pushed to the background and the attack on Leningrad will be conducted by Manstein, but he understood that the High Command was guided by Manstein's experience, acquired after the attack on Sevastopol. Hitler gave the order, according to which Field Marshal Manstein was to command the troops during the fighting for the boiler between Lake Ladoga and Mgay, as well as in front of Leningrad. In this case, Manstein was not subordinate to Army Group North, and could give orders to the troops independently, reporting to the Supreme Command and the Chief of General Staff, Colonel General Golda at the command post in Vinnytsia in Ukraine, close to the areas of operations conducted in the Caucasus and at Stalingrad. The question of supply, however, remained further in the hands of the 18th Army, that is, a well-established organisation on the Northern Front. For Colonel General Lindemann, who had proved in the Volkhov and Pogostievskoye cauldrons that he could fight on such territories in impenetrable forests, it was still a great offence. But the Field Marshal was already here, and all 4 formations that arrived with him were his own Crimean divisions. The Colonel General treated this in a chivalrous manner, handing over the main reins to the higher command, and saw to it that the cooperation between the 2 commanding armies proceeded without complications. The 11th Army now commanded XX Army Corps on the southern side of the Cauldron and XXVI Army Corps on its northern side. In addition, L Army Corps stood on the banks of the Neva and in front of Leningrad, and Liv Corps at the Oranienbaum bridgehead. The 18th Army was located on the Volkhov River from Novgorod to Karishi and around the Pogostievsky Cauldron, and more specifically its XXXVII and XXVII Corps. This arrangement of forces was maintained until October 31st, after which Colonel General Lindemann again took over the entire area. In order to fight in the Cauldron, it was first of all necessary to provide a reliable defence of both flanks and to prevent the expansion of the breakthrough area. The enemy had not yet managed to get out of the woodlands, completely unsuitable for conducting an offensive. In the north, in the hands of the Germans, remained an important Sinyavinskaya height, in the west Kelkolovo, and in the southwest MGA Junction Station. On the southern edge of the Cauldron, fought under the command of the XXX Corps Headquarters 24, 132 and 170 Infantry Divisions, which in late September joined the 3rd Mountain Rifle Division, which fully reformed and rested during the journey, gave its tour here, so that next to each other fought now divisions of the icy Northern Front and subtropical Crimea. The 12th Armoured Division was also put into action near Tortolov, while the 223rd Division backed up near Voronov to the east, sometimes supported by units of the 96th Division. In the west and north of the Cauldron fought XXVI Corps, consisting of the 28th Jaeger Division, the 5th Mountain Division east of Sinyavino, and the 121st Division on the Black River, where more units of the 227th Division stood near the enemy positions. Of course, even here we could not do without the use of mixed formations, as well as the introduction of temporary combat formations and other improvised units, so that a number of battalions fought as part of regiments and divisions alien to them. After heavy defensive fighting and counterattacks, it had been possible to prevent the expansion of the Cauldron, and it was now necessary to narrow on both flanks of the breakthrough and close it. This could only be achieved in fierce fighting against the enemy forces constantly attacking from the east. On the Leningrad front, it was also necessary to repulse the attacks of Russian divisions east of Kolpin. In addition, the enemy forced the Neva River near Dubrovka, but having occupied a small bridgehead, he had no further success. Offensives in secondary directions could not change the situation in the Cauldron. By September 21st, it was possible to isolate the enemy, after which Field Marshal von Manstein ordered the infantry to destroy the Cauldron in a complex, swampy terrain. The infantry units were supported by heavy artillery and mortar fire, as well as anti-aircraft artillery and Luftwaffe air units. Along with the infantrymen, especially distinguished engineering units, which under constant Russian fire had to demine the terrain and destroy bunkers. The powerful fire of artillery allowed the German command, in cooperation with squadrons of bombers and dive bombers of the VIII Air Corps, to smash 8 rifle divisions, 6 rifle brigades and 4 tank brigades surrounded in the Cauldron, and turn the swampy forest into an underworld for them. You can read about it in a diary that ended up in the hands of the Germans. The diary belonged to the commander of a Soviet regiment, in which he described in detail the situation in the Cauldron at the time. 2.05. Here we are again under Gaitolov. 4.09. Yesterday a combat order was given breakthrough to the Leningrad highway near Dubrovka. It seems that further advancement, without preliminary widening of the breakthrough on the flanks, would be unwise. Nevertheless, after the decision of the Corps Commander, Major General Gagan, our 861st Rifle Regiment has been advancing all day today without moving from its position. By 18 hours, the regiment lost 65% of its personnel and all commanders. On September 4th and 5, we do not advance. 9.09. The personnel is melting before our eyes and no success. Shouting, noise, threats and curses are heard, but it doesn't help anything anymore. 12.09. Enemy aircraft constantly dropping bombs. The whole ground is shaking from the bombing. It seems that the Germans want to raze everything to the ground here. Their bombers come in an endless stream and drop bombs, 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 bombs. When will it end? It's hell all around. To develop our breakthrough, the VI Guards Rifle Corps arrived with the 22nd, 23rd and 55th Rifle Brigades and other units. Today they're advancing. What successes they have, I do not know. Probably the same as ours. This operation is costing us dearly. On the strip 2 kilometers wide, stretching to the front line corpses and corpses of horses and people. 16.09. From these bomb attacks you can go crazy. From this devil's cauldron, it is hardly possible to get out alive. A year ago, the same stupidity, the same mistakes were made on this very same spot, leading to the same failures. When will we have it like the others? 18.09. Now I have felt all the pleasures of war. And now the last pleasure, encirclement. No mail, no food, ammunition is also almost gone. Daily rations are stretched for 4 days. 27.09. Artillery shells are constantly chopping to pieces the forest, which remained untouched for centuries. Now it is already unrecognizable. Our operation is equal to 0. In the ring of encirclement was 6 divisions 374th, 259th, 19th, 191st, 24th, 294th, of which 2 guards divisions, 6 brigades, several mortar and artillery regiments. To be correct, these are simply the numbers of the compounds, of each of which only 7%, 8% or 10%. The 4th day without food, ammunition is running low. Enemy fire is terrible. We are all in expectation of annihilation. Everywhere we try to probe for a loophole, any gap is closed. Until October 2nd, the Soviet forces in the cauldron were destroyed. Over 12,000 prisoners captured. Russian losses in manpower exceeded German losses many times over. 300 guns, 500 mortars and 200 more 24 tanks were taken as trophies or destroyed. The battlefield between shattered trees and waterlogged craters filled with military equipment and the corpses of Russian soldiers and horses made a horrible picture. As German radio broadcast a report of success, the operator of the Russian jamming transmitter shouted in German all lies. There was no battle at Gaitolov at all. But it did take place, resulting in the re-defeat of the Second Shock Army and the maintenance of the blockade of Leningrad. This result was also part of the objective of the German offensive on Leningrad. The divisions intended for this task were mostly used in defensive battles, and therefore required replenishment and rest until they were able to launch an offensive, the prospects for which Field Marshal Manstein labelled as somewhat problematic. In addition, much of the ammunition provided for the operation had been shot up at Gaitolov, which also required replenishment. Field Marshal Manstein's plans stipulated that during the offensive of 3 corps, supported by heavy artillery fire and the VIII Air Corps, the defensive fortifications of Leningrad would be broken through. The city itself was not to be attacked, but it was necessary to defeat the enemy forces between Leningrad and Lake Ladoga by encircling them. Thus Manstein wanted to avoid street fighting, fraught with heavy losses. Hitler's intentions through powerful airstrikes to force a major city to surrender Field Marshal Manstein and General von Richthofen considered utopia. Now, after the battle, Hitler still adhered to his positions, but had to reconcile with the necessary delay in the offensive and, in addition, not so large scale to set the goals of the offensive. Under these conditions, the final decision was still hardly possible. The participation of the Finns in the offensive, although desirable, was for political reasons unrealistic. In the course of all these considerations ended in October, after which the development of events on the Central Front and above all the threatening situation at Stalingrad put an end to all these plans. The 11th Army and the XXX Corps headquarters were withdrawn from the front, and Field Marshal von Manstein himself became commander of Army Group Don. On October 31st, the 18th Army again took command of the entire Volkhov, Ladoga, Leningrad, Oranienbaum area. Concentration of troops for the offensive against Leningrad has significantly weakened. In addition, the central and above all the southern sections of the Eastern Front, as a result of the severe crisis situation around Stalingrad, required new forces. First to leave the area of deployment of the 18th Army were the 3rd Mountain Division and the 12th Panzer Division, followed by the 269th, 93rd, 291st Infantry Divisions, the 20th Motorized Division, as well as the 58th and 225th Infantry Divisions, until mid-December. As replacements, the army received the 69th Infantry Division and the 1st, 9th and 10th Luftwaffe Field Divisions, which could only tentatively be called combat-ready units. These were troops with excellent soldiers and excellent material and technical support, but their command structure and training did not meet the requirements of fighting on land. All of them were the brainchild of the wayward Göring, who did not want to transfer the land forces of the Luftwaffe soldiers, so it was a temporary measure to use these units on presumably quiet parts of the front, with the army command taking care to help them with teachers and instructors. The VIII Air Corps was also transferred to the Stalingrad front, so that soon the superiority of Soviet aviation became tangible here. As a result of all these manipulations with the troops, the plan to take Leningrad by offensive finally failed. The overall situation no longer allowed to count on the fact that the Northern Front to solve its problems will be provided with sufficiently powerful forces that could surpass the enemy's forces. It was no longer possible to hope to force Leningrad to surrender by means of a blockade, due to the construction of new ships, as well as the organization of traffic on the ice road during the winter, greatly improved the supply situation in Leningrad, especially since, thanks to the evacuation, of the number of eaters decreased. Leningraders could now no longer fear the need and hunger they had experienced in the winter of 1941-42, although life in the besieged city was still harsh and dangerous. The propaganda of the party and the Soviet authorities became more and more effective, the people's spirits perked up, people had a sense of pride in their strength and in their endurance. All life entered a normal rhythm, even cultural events were held, though in a rather modest framework. The German troops were still fighting to keep the blockade of Leningrad, but first of all they were aiming to keep close contact with the Finns, so that they would not leave the front. An organized and planned withdrawal of the Northern Front to the line of Lake Peipsi Narva, which the enemy could hardly seriously interfere with, would now be the solution that would save forces and create a stock of operational reserves. Knowing Hitler's principles, Army Group North, for which such a withdrawal was simply necessary, could never count on his approval of this operation, so it was left to fate. While a crisis was brewing in the south of the Eastern Front, the Volkhov-Leningrad front once again went into positional warfare. The soldiers again began a monotonous lifeguard duty and reconnaissance on stretched sections of the front, earthwork and other types of work, and to a limited extent the training of soldiers, non-commissioned officers, and officers. Artillery shelling and frequent enemy attacks constantly resulted in casualties. The quietest was the section of the front between the Kirov Railroad and Gaitolov, where the Germans were able to improve and strengthen their positions after the battle. There were also local battles near Gruzin, Karishi, and on the encirclement front near Leningrad. All positions were preparing for winter by resupplying, cutting wood, and making charcoal briquettes. This time excellent winter clothing was delivered on time, which made it hoped that the number of frostbites would be much less than in the previous winter. Echelons brought in resupply, but in most cases not in the numbers planned, and many divisions had 2 battalions each with reinforcement units in their grenadier regiments. In regard to the care of the troops, who were still affected by the monotony of the long winter nights, everything possible was attempted. In large tents, barracks or blockhouses, in which the troops up to the regimental commanders were stationed, movies were shown, performances of frontline brigades, concerts by regimental musicians and other things were performed. In addition, a church service was held, for which people were alternately removed from their positions for several hours. Rooms equipped as baths, saunas and disinfestation chambers allowed the soldiers to maintain hygiene and change their underwear on time. During the respite, soldiers were also eager to do all sorts of crafts, usually made of wood. Some divisions changed sections of their positions. The army consisted of 24 large compounds, among which were field divisions of the Luftwaffe, not trained for fighting on the ground, 4 Crimean divisions, already proven themselves in battle, the rest of the Volkhov divisions and another 1 division, just arrived from Norway. December 15th, near Novgorod, along the Volkhov stood XXXVIII Corps, consisting of the 1st Field Division of the Luftwaffe, 212th and 254th Infantry Divisions. To them adjoined the I Corps, consisting of the 121st and 24th Infantry Divisions. On both sides of the mouth of the Tugoda River, near Karishi and around the Pogostievskoye cauldron, were XXVI I Corps with the 21st, 217th, 11th, 61st, 132nd and 69th Infantry Divisions. In the area of the bottleneck, command was carried out by XXVI Corps, which included 223rd, 1st, 227th and 170th Infantry Divisions. Here and north of MGA stood the only reserve of the 18th Army, namely the 96th Infantry Division pulled up from Pogosti, but even it had some parts of the Grenadier Regiment and artillery used in the area of the Kirov Railroad as part of the divisions that had taken up positions here. On the Leningrad front, the Liv Corps with the 5th Mountain Division, the SS Polizei Division, the 250th Spanish Division, and the 215th Infantry Division held their positions up to the Gulf of Finland. In front of the Oranienbaum bridgehead, L Corps was preparing to transfer command to the Luftwaffe I Field Corps by January 1st. Here stood the 2nd SS Infantry Brigade and the 10th Luftwaffe Field Division. After Stalingrad was surrounded, the Soviets stepped up their propaganda using loudspeakers, radio and leaflets, which even depicted a plan that made it clear for the first time the serious position in which the 6th Army found itself. The effectiveness of Soviet propaganda was small. Cases of conversion to the enemy occurred mainly among Upper Silesian and other half-Polish soldiers, who in their homeland were often persecuted by NSDAP party functionaries. The 18th Army anticipated a new Russian offensive in January 1943, when the ice on the Neva River would be strong enough to hold tanks. The weather and short winter days prevented aerial reconnaissance. The command assumed that the Russians this time would have the same objectives as during the summer battle, but would advance with even greater tenacity across the ice-covered Neva. The army realized that it would have to fight, counting only on its own forces, since Stalingrad and the Caucasus had chained all the available reserves of the High Command. The plans of the Soviet command really corresponded to these assumptions. The first stage of the offensive had somewhat smaller objectives than the summer battle. The large-scale plan for the winter battle of 1942, which had an operational character, turned into a limited tactical operation, which undoubtedly made it possible to concentrate troops and equipment in one place. The objectives were as follows: first, the large peat bog on the southern shore of Lake Ladoga, together with Schlisselburg and villages Nose, 1 to 5 and 7 to 8, then the Sinyavinskaya Heights, and finally the MGA Junction Station, and from there the connection with the Leningrad front at Kolpin. In accordance with this plan, 3 following stages of the battle were envisaged: the main stage from February 12th to February 3rd, the first bilateral coverage from February 10th to February 24th, and the second bilateral coverage from March 19th to April 5th, 1943. To the advancing Soviet units were pulled up another 10 divisions and 12 brigades, among which were many newly formed units. The remaining formations were replenished, although the staffing levels in some companies were reduced by 20 to 25%, but the availability of heavy weapons such as artillery, mortars, multi-barrel rocket launchers, tanks and airplanes exceeded all expectations. Marshals Zhukov, Voroshilov and Timoshenko took part in this operation. No one had any doubt that everything was at stake. The demise of the German troops at Stalingrad was at that moment a matter of weeks, and the liberation of Leningrad was to complete the success of the winter battles of the Soviet troops. On January 12th, the second battle on Lake Ladoga began, and it began with the hurricane fire of 220 batteries, numerous rocket launchers and heavy mortars, with Soviet aviation making full use of its absolute superiority. 12 rifle divisions and 2 brigades, as well as a mechanized shock division, began the offensive from the northeast between the Kirov Railroad and the shore of the lake near Lipki. Supported by the fire of 100 batteries on the western shore, 3 divisions with large tank units crossed the Neva from the west on the section from the southern outskirts of Schlisselburg to Dubrovka. The width of the offensive front was in the east 30 kilometers, in the west, where south of Marin was the main blow, a little less. During the first 6 days, the Russians doubled the number of attacking units due to the reserves located in the immediate vicinity. In the battle were thrown 450 tanks, which on the German side opposed only one unit of tanks, Tiger, and other weak units of tanks and self-propelled guns. There was not a single tank division in the entire 18th Army. There are no exact figures on the number of tanks available to the Germans. It could be no more than 20 to 30 tanks, which, as a rule, were used in groups of 4 to 5 tanks as a fire defense. Once again, two flanks of the breakthrough were formed, which held firm and thus narrowed the Soviet offensive band, so that the Russians were only able to achieve a primary tactical success. The 1st East Prussian Division defended its positions on both sides of Gaitolov and was joined by Colonel Wingler and his regiment. After fierce fighting, Settlement No. 8 was abandoned. On the Neva River near Dubrovka and Gorodok, the 170th Division with the 399th Grenadier Regiment, commanded by Colonel Griesbach, repulsed Soviet advances. The enemy still managed to make a breakthrough on a weak section of the front near Murin. Thus, from east to west, the Soviet units broke through a large peat bog to Pozolok No. 5, where the only road connecting Sinyavino and Schlisselburg passed, seeking to cut off the northern part of the bottleneck where the main forces of the 227th Division fought. In this connection, separate battalions and mobile units of the 96th Division were immediately thrown into the fight, with the result that the only army reserve was in the thick of the battle on the first day. When on the 8th day of the battle, the main forces of this reserve took the offensive against Marino, it still had only 5 battalions and parts of its own artillery at its disposal. By vigorous attack it again managed to free from the enemy forest, in which some time ago fought Colonel Shaidis, and the ring road to the west of it, as well as the power station Gorodok, but to break through to Marino forces was still not enough. After these operations, the last shock reserve of the army was exhausted. The battles were now to be fought by individual regiments and battalions. As the first replenishment forces the army transferred here by vehicles from the eastern outskirts of the Pogostivskoye cauldron, 2 reinforced grenadier regiments, 151st and 162nd of the 61st Division Major General Tuneran through Settlement No. 5 threw these units into the battle as Guna's combat group south of the lake shore. From Lipok to Schlisselburg, which was still held by the 328th Grenadier Regiment Kol. Lamy and through the woods to Gorodok on the Neva was a boiling cauldron of hell. Settlement No. 5, located in the central part of the swamp, was the tactically important point for which everyone ultimately fought. Here the 374th Regiment under Colonel Belov held their positions, fighting alternately in the eastern and western directions, and the heavy weapons batteries of the 96th Infantry Division under Major Lieberkun, who sometimes had to engage in close combat. More and more the ring of encirclement around the mixed battalions of the 61st, 96th, and 227th Divisions, which were now united in the Tuna Group, was narrowing. The Soviets were using 8 divisions and 4 brigades with large numbers of tanks in the area. The Russians were advancing from the east and west and even from the north across the ice of the frozen lake. For one German battalion there was more than one Russian division. The XXVI Corps had to create a new front between the Wingler ledge and the Neva. An important point of this front was the bare Sinyavinskaya heights, which would soon become the focus of the entire battle. The sappers of the 96th Division, the mountain gamekeepers of the 5th Mountain Rifle Division, the soldiers of the SS Polizei Division, and the artillerymen of the 227th Division took cover in snow-covered bomb craters and withstood any attack, while on the peat bog and near the hospital of Gorodok here and there the battles of the 96th and 170th Infantry Divisions with the Russians broke out. The superiority of the enemy forces was too oppressive. On January 17th, the Army Command ordered Tuna's group, which was completely dependent on air supply, to make a breakthrough, realizing at the same time that there were no longer available forces that could, in the event of a Russian counteroffensive, restore the front in the northern part of the bottleneck. It was not an easy decision to make. Since there was no hope that the army would ever have enough forces at its disposal to regain the lost territory. But now it was primarily a question of holding the front on both sides of the Sinyavinskaya heights and the height itself. Tuna's group managed to make a breakthrough through Settlement No. 5 during heavy close fighting on the night of January 17th to 18th. All the wounded were dragged behind them, Several batteries stationed in the area left their guns blown up. Other heavy weapons were also lost. More than once, soldiers of the 151st Regiment, which was leading the column, managed to break through further south in close combat with a grenade in their hand, and their commander, Major Krudsky, was killed. The Russians were constantly throwing new forces to the place of the breakthrough, so the units, grenadiers, tank fighters of the 96th Division, gun crews of the 227th Infantry Division, and all the others still in the cauldron had to retake the same areas of terrain. All the horror of that night will forever remain in the memory of all participants in that breakthrough. After their success, the Russians turned their troops to the south with the aim of capturing the Sinyavinskaya heights by means of a two-way engagement. The Russians knew that the 10-kilometer strip of peat bog, where there were no paved roads, was of only tentative importance, while German artillery observers were at the height. Attempts to cover the height from the east were repulsed by parts of the East Prussian Division. Within 10 days, 7 Russian divisions were advancing here. In the following days, the Russians threw 5 more rifle divisions and 5 brigades, as well as 4 tank brigades and 8 tank battalions into the battle for the height. A new hotbed of fighting erupted at the western foot of the height, where fighting for settlement No. 6 was taking place. The 18th Army was also forced to pull up new forces here. Under the command of the commander of the Liv Corps created Group Hilbert, which in turn was subordinated to the XXVI Corps. All this was done to ensure that the fighting in the territory of the bottleneck were conducted under a unified command. On January 17th, in accordance with the order, the forward positions of the 284th Grenadier Regiment were abandoned in order to level the front line between settlement No. 6 and Gorodok. On January 24th, the eastern flank of the throat was defended by the 223rd and 1st Infantry Divisions. On both sides of the Sinyavinskaya Heights, and up to the Neva River in the area from Gorodok to Otradnoy, were defended by mixed battalions and companies of the 61st Division, SS Division Polizei, 28th Airborne Division, 170th, 227th and 96th Infantry Divisions, 5th Mountain Division, as well as the 269th Spanish Grenadier Regiment. Thus the 18th Army used 9 divisions on the battlefield. Its 16 remaining divisions defended long stretches of the front, from Novgorod to Pogosti, and in front of Leningrad and Oranienbaum. From them, by the end of January, were thrown into the battle for Sinyavino another 11th and 21st Divisions, so the ratio of forces became 11-14. With this distribution of forces the front held, but with the overall tense situation at the end of January, Stalingrad was surrendered could not count on the supply of any reserves. In the divisions named, most of the regiments turned into battalions. Losses among officers were very high. The forces were depleted every day. But despite this, the units that suffered heavy losses held on. Engineer battalions, rifle companies of artillerymen, communications and tank fighters, and anti-aircraft artillery units filled the gaps between the grenadiers. The Russians were constantly on the offensive, but the front held at Sinyavinskaya Heights, at Pozolok No. 6, at Burmar Street near the hospital, and at the Gorodok power station, as well as at the bridgehead at Dubrovka. At the end of the month, the Russians regrouped their troops. In the east, the 8th Army went on the defensive under the onslaught of German attacks to stiffen its units. The 2nd Shock Army had to storm the Sinyavinskaya Height, and the 67th Army to break through between the Height and the Neva to Mustalov. On January 29th, the second offensive began. With the support of assault aircraft and tank armadas, a deadly wave of attacking troops rolled from the peat bog in the direction of Height 43.3. In a section of 2.5 kilometers wide, 35 battalions attacked the Sinyavinskaya Heights for 10 days. The defenders located themselves in their snow shelters and bomb craters, held on and constantly threw the enemy who had broken through back to the swamp. The losses of the offensive were extremely high. During new offensives between February 12th and February 23rd, echelons of the advancing forces reached the very heights and the ruins of the church, but the counterattacks of the 11th Division constantly threw them back. On one of these February days, the heated situation threatened to break through the defence, but here helped parts of the East Prussian Division, as well as Silesian units located on their left. The wedge of the front, which had moved forward at Gorodok, in the night from 15 to 17 February was pulled back in order to reduce it. The battle entered its second phase. The Sinyavinskaya Heights still commanded the attention and strength of the German command when the Soviets launched their first offensive, with the aim of covering to strike from the east and west-south of MGA at weak German positions and cut off the German front north of MGA. From February 10th to February 23rd, 4 divisions, 3 brigades, and 2 tank brigades of the Russians were advancing from the Pogostivevsko cauldron south of Vinograd. At the same time, 7 divisions, 5 brigades and 3 tank brigades were advancing from Kolpin towards Krasny Bor. As a result of these operations, there were new dangerous hotbeds, especially since at the disposal of the German army was no longer any fresh forces. It was once again about juggling. People were collected literally down to the last soldier. In the battle were to enter the battle groups from different divisions, exhausted battalions, which were still in the stage of staffing. Between Klosterdorf and Smedinia, parts of the 96th, 121st and 217th Divisions managed to stop the Russian breakthrough and once again take from the enemy part of his small territory. The blow at Krasny Bor with all its force fell on the 250th Spanish Division. On February 10th, after a powerful fire preparation, the Russians attacked on both sides of Kolpin. The Spaniards held firm and suffered heavy losses. Especially great losses were among officers. The most important difficulty for the Spaniards was that they did not have enough anti-tank defences against Russian tanks. Krasny Bor and the area near Izora, to a depth of about 3 kilometres, were lost, and it was no longer possible to prevent it. The counterattack of parts of the 212th Infantry Division stopped the enemy. The 24th Division was withdrawn from the area on the Middle Volkhov, and, as well as parts of the 215th Division, was used here for defence and counterattacks. The Russians suffered heavy losses, but were unable to capture any new territory. The Russian operational objective of uniting the 55th Army at Krasny Bor with the 54th Army from the Pogostievskoye cauldron was not achieved. As for the 18th Army, again had to eliminate the crisis situation with its own forces, which it did. This was happening at a time when on the southern front, after the Stalingrad disaster, the dangerous operational situation on the southern front was approaching a crisis of enormous proportions, which required the German High Command to make the most extreme decisions and use the latest reserves. The 18th Army thus had to rely only on its own forces. It knew that upstairs was not up to it. In early March, the fighting temporarily subsided. The command and troops of the army were engaged in the equipment of positions and roads, replenished supplies and equipment to be fully armed before new battles. March 10th, Gilbert's group was disbanded. New Russian attacks were not long in coming, though they started quite far from the battlefield on Lake Ladoga. The 52nd Soviet Army made its attack on the southern flank of the 18th Army with the strength of 4 divisions with the aim of taking Novgorod. This operation was to be part of a major battle and to divert German forces from the main battle area. This offensive failed because of the well-prepared defence of the XXVIII Army Corps, and after 9 days it was abandoned. After that, on March 19th, the Battle of Lake Ladoga entered its third phase. This time the strike was to be directed directly at MGA. The second offensive with the purpose of coverage was conducted from the east-south of Voronov in the direction of Karbu-Selai, with the forces of 10 divisions, 2 brigades and 7 tank brigades. They were to be met by 6 divisions, 2 brigades and 5 tank brigades from the Krasny Bor area. If this strike was successful, the enemy would seize the Kirov Railroad and the important railroad connection with Leningrad. The area of the struggle for Sinyavino was in the hands of the winner, like a ripe fruit falling from the sky. At the beginning of the third phase in the territory of the bottleneck were involved 223rd Division at Karbusel, 1st and 212th Divisions on both sides of the Gaitolov, 11th Division on the Sinyavino Heights, 28th Airborne Division on the Sinyavino Heights, 28th Airborne Division on the Peat Bog and 5th Mountain Infantry Division on the Neva. Command was exercised by the XXVI Corps. On the Leningrad front stood the divisions of the L Corps, the SS Polesi Division, the 24th Division, parts of the 215th Division Hein Group, the 250th Spanish Division, and the 250th Spanish Division, and the 215th Division. On the coast, coastal batteries and temporary combat formations of Latvian volunteers provided. The Iranian bomb bridgehead was isolated by the III Luftwaffe Airfield Corps, consisting of the 9th and 10th Luftwaffe Airfield Divisions. The fight for both cauldrons continued until the first days of April. Melted snow and liquid mud made life difficult for the troops in their positions, and thus demanded the highest degree of fortitude and endurance from the grenadiers, sappers, gun crews, and signalmen. Near Karishi, during the offensive, the enemy managed to seize several square kilometers of swampy forest. The army threw reinforcements into the battle 69th, 121st, 21st Infantry Divisions and 5th Mountain Division, as a result of which the Russian breakthrough was stopped, and in some places Russian units were thrown back. The Shapki MGA road was saved and served for the German command as a rocade road from the Pogostevskoye cauldron to the bottleneck. At Krasny Bor it was also necessary to use new reserves, as the defensive fighting was exhausting the troops. Here the 58th, 170th and 254th Divisions were thrown into action. In the course of heavy fighting they managed to limit the Russian breakthrough to a small area. Nikolskoye and Sabino remained out of reach for the Russians. All these forces that the German command used in the defensive battles were not free reserves at its disposal. They were units and formations recently withdrawn from major battles, and which were supposed to be used or had already been used in quiet sections of the front for the purpose of manning and rest. In these engagements, most of them were taking part in a major battle for the third time. Cold and damp, snow and mud, alternating with each other, exhausted the soldiers' strength. Only with the onset of darkness, if there was luck, a field kitchen came up, but the food in most cases was already cold. Because of the shortage of men, the soldiers had almost no rest during guard duty and shantung work. All this required tremendous physical and mental strain from both soldiers and commanders. All soldiers of the 18th Army, standing between the Volkhov, Sinyavinskaya Heights and Leningrad, were really real fighters. The troops again experienced all the disgrace of the Russian winter, which reminded with its crackling frosts the winter of 1941/42, but this time the soldiers had appropriate winter clothes and enough experience of fighting in winter conditions. When the wind blew from the icy surface of Lake Ladoga across the bare Sinyavinskaya Heights and whirled the snow or brought new snow, the forests could no longer serve as shelter and protection as before, as there were only shattered bare trunks left of the trees, rising into the grey winter sky. The heavily marshy terrain made it impossible to entrench in the ground, and the lack of air cover gave the Soviet Air Force great opportunities to attack. In early April, Russian losses in manpower and equipment, as well as the coming period of thawing, foreshadowed the end of the second battle on Lake Ladoga. For 10 weeks of heavy defensive fighting, the 18th Army succeeded. In the hands of the enemy remained, however, a strip of 10 kilometers wide on the southern shore of Lake Ladoga, together with Schlisselburg, a section of peat bog, which lacked a road from the east to the Neva. An order was given, and the Russians built a track on the southern shore, but it was located in a zone of German artillery fire. The first train with military supplies and representatives of the Moscow central authorities arrived in Schlisselburg already on February 7, 1943. The Sinyavinskaya Heights, for which fierce battles were fought and which was strewn with bomb craters, were still in the hands of the Germans. In total, the Soviets used in the battle 48 rifle divisions and 19 brigades, 1 mechanized attack division, 19 tank brigades or regiments, and 10 independent tank battalions, as well as powerful air forces and a huge number of batteries of heavy and light artillery. Casualties in manpower amounted to 270,000. Of 1,200 tanks, 847 were destroyed or out of service, and of 1,000 airplanes, 693 were shot down. Now positional warfare with its daily routine began again, digging trenches and building roads, reconnaissance and guard duty, sorties by reconnaissance teams of both sides to capture prisoners and obtain intelligence, shelling by artillery and mortars. Military everyday life, about which not a word was said in the Wehrmacht reports, but which daily brought losses in the form of killed and wounded, which were marked by incredible tension and expenditure of effort, hard work and inclement weather, during which the soldiers had almost no rest. There was no substitute. Replenishment arrived from Germany, those who had recovered from their wounds and were returning to their old guard, as well as new soldiers of different birth years who had completed their military training. But only a few divisions, such as the former Crimean divisions, could afford to have a third battalion in their 3 regiments. A rifle battalion was gradually formed for each division, which included a reconnaissance squadron or division. The divisional field battalions were to train the replenishment and also provide training for junior officers. Echelons with vacationers came and went. Next to vacationers who were on leave, more and more wounded leavers appeared. Vacation homes in the Baltics invited soldiers to rest for a short time and enjoy life a little. The war on paper, from higher headquarters to companies and batteries, was coming into its own. The entire vast apparatus of the service of the Chief of the Rear Army districts, which faced numerous tasks, demanded work and strove to fulfill their duty for the benefit of the troops. In 1943, the partisans intensified their activities in the dense swampy forests between the Volkhov and the Gulf of Finland. Weapons and people for them Russian aviation dropped behind the front line. The saboteurs were infiltrating through the thin German front line or coming from the rear area of the 16th Army northward to the area northeast of Ladoga. A lot of weapons, equipment and ammunition were still left lying in the area where the encirclement fighting took place in 1942. Sections of railroad tracks and individual vehicles on the roads were attacked. The soldiers of the 322nd Guard Regiment, militia battalions and other units of the 285th Guard Division, who had proven themselves in the heavy fighting in 1942 in the Volkhov cauldron, had no respite. Partisan warfare in the rugged wooded terrain around Ladoga and Osmin, on the Ladoga and Oridesh rivers, on the railroad and roads leading to the front, put tough demands on the troops. Large and small groups of partisans were tracked down, destroyed or dispersed on the terrain. New groups appeared in their place, which required new actions on the part of German units. However, the forests were never completely cleared of partisans. Meanwhile, fighting continued on the Nevsky front, near Kolpin, Karbusel and Voronov, and everywhere old soldiers enjoyed well-deserved authority among young comrades and their commanders. At the very beginning of the summer of 1943, the units of the 18th Army, rested and replenished, occupied fortified positions on the established front line. From Novgorod to the area of Spasskaya Polisti, that is, partly on the upper Volkhov, partly by the highway, stood XXVII Corps, consisting of the 1st Field Division of the Luftwaffe, the 217th Infantry Division, and the Latvian Volunteer Brigade. From these positions, and up to the area northeast of Chudov, which was 15 kilometers, was located I Corps, consisting of the 13th Field Division of the Luftwaffe and the 227th Infantry Division. Here adjoined the much stronger XXVII I Corps with its 96th Infantry Division on both sides of the Tugoda, with the 61st Infantry Division on the site of the Champagne Cork, and on the Karishi bridgehead, with the 81st Infantry Division, 12th Field Division of the Luftwaffe, 225th and 132nd Infantry Divisions around the Pogostivskoe cauldron. The XXVI Corps, as before, held positions in front of the bottleneck, in the east near Karbusel, Voronov and Gaitolov with the 212th, 69th Infantry Division and 5th Mountain Division south, and the 1st Infantry Division north of the Kirov Railroad. In the north with the 290th Infantry Division on both sides of the Wingler protrusion, the 11th Infantry Division on the Sinyavinskaya Heights, and the 23rd Infantry Division on the Moika to the Neva. The southern section of the Leningrad positions was defended by the Liv Corps with the 21st Infantry Division on the Neva, the SS Polizei Division, the 24th, 58th and 254th Infantry Divisions on both sides of Krasnoye Bor. Adjoining them from Pushkin to Yuritskirsk was L Corps with its 250th Spanish Division, 170th and 215th Infantry Divisions on the northern flank near the Gulf of Finland. The Luftwaffe II Field Corps covered the Oranienbaum bridgehead with the Luftwaffe's 9th and 10th Field Divisions. The Army kept 2 divisions as reserves, namely the 121st Infantry Division and the 28th Airborne Division. This disposition of forces reflects the situation on July 21, 1943, that is just before the beginning of the Third Battle on Lake Ladoga. This situation with slight deviations had existed since April. Here and there some divisions were replaced or moved, but most of them had been occupying their positions for a long time. Along with the daily position battles of reconnaissance and strike groups, sniper fire and fire raids, small and large battles broke out, and Russian companies, battalions and brigades were repulsed. It was especially turbulent in places of breakthrough, on bridgeheads and other similar areas, which sometimes had to be recaptured for several days. Among such centres were, in particular, the area near Novgorod, at the Finger, near Dimno, at the German bridgehead in Gruzin, at the Russian breakthrough site on the Tugoda River, near the positions of the 96th Division, which in May had to participate in water fighting north of the mouth of the Tugoda River. Here, on the section of the 284th Grenadier Regiment, the enemy crossed the river at night in numerous boats and broke through to the positions of the 3rd Battalion. The regimental commander, Lieutenant Colonel Putzner, ordered the 2nd Battalion to launch a counterattack. For 4 hours the grenadiers slapped the water in the area of the floods, after which fierce fighting succeeded in destroying the enemy. On the Karishi bridgehead, where the 61st Infantry Division replaced the 217th Division, it was also turbulent. Here some German units in their bridgehead held their positions without any replacement, although supply through the temporary bridge on the Volkhov, which was under constant fire, was particularly difficult and often accompanied by heavy losses. The soldiers were reluctant to change positions to which they were accustomed. In the bottleneck, also calm, never came Karbusel, Gaitolovo, the swamp at Wingler's Ledge, the Sinyavinskaya height, on which the 11th Division still stood, and west of it under Pozolokno. 6. As well as on the Moika, these were the places where difficult situations constantly arose. The next hotbeds of tension were the battle area near Krasny Bor, the Spanish position around Pushkin, and the trenches of the 170th and 215th Divisions in the fields strewn with bomb craters and in the ruins of Staropanov and Juggling. Thus the period of thawing with its flooded roads and battlefields was replaced by summer with its myriads of mosquitoes, giving the Germans, the inhabitants of Central Europe, unbearable agony, all in the same area to which they had already become accustomed and in which the troops could no longer have any new experiences. At the same time, on other parts of the Eastern Front, the monotony of positional warfare was being replaced by maneuverable fighting characterized by both forced retreats and offensive operations. The Soviet command also had its main interest in the fronts in the south and center. The Russian troops on the Volkhov and Leningrad fronts also had to make do with their own forces. Although the number of their airplanes was increased to 1,000 units, the artillery of the reserve of the General Command, heavy mortars and Katyushas were reinforced, but the arrival of new units could not be counted on. The replenishment of units was carried out at the expense of those who returned from wounded leave, those who passed re-examination, as well as rear units and headquarters. The personnel of companies was reduced by 25 men, the number of machine guns was reduced from 12 to 9. The remnants of the defeated rifle brigades became part of the advancing divisions, while the divisions that were in defense were left without replenishment. The struggle for the liberation of Leningrad continued in the summer of 1943. Having achieved partial success in the winter, the Russians sought to build on this success and fought in the summer, as a result of which they finally seized the railroad to Leningrad. Now it was a question of first capturing the Sinyavinskaya heights, but not by frontal attacks, which they failed, and try to bypass it from the flanks, that is, from the forests in the area of the Black River and the triangle of roads under settlement, No. 6. In doing so, the Russians had to break through the German positions on the heights. The goal remained the same, the railroad junction MDA. There were no other goals, as well as no new plans and large-scale, stunning operations, but just the continuation of the second battle on Lake Ladoga. The German command had been waiting for this battle since June and could not prevent it with any retaliatory operations, as there were no forces and means to do so. Based on the current situation, it had to abandon its own initiatives and could only plan any defensive actions and occasionally take appropriate countermeasures, an extremely thankless task for commanders. The Soviet offensive of July 22, 1943 coincided in time with operations in the central part of the Eastern Front. Hurricane fire and powerful attacks from the air ploughed the long-suffering land, crushed the already thinning forest into chips. The battle had begun. The 67th Army with 5 divisions was advancing from the north. The main blow was made by the XXX Guards Rifle Corps. The 8th Army with the same forces was advancing from the east. The Guards Corps managed to break through in 2 places at the triangle of roads under settlement, No. 6 west of Sinyavinskaya Height, and at the station Rangoon to the bank of the Neva. The 11th East Prussian Division and the 23rd Brandenburg Division could not prevent these breakthroughs. In the following days, in the course of more and more attacks, fought for the decisive outcome of the battle. The 18th Army first put its reserves into action, the 121st Division on the eastern section of the front, and the 28th Airborne Division on the northern section west of the Sinyavinsk Heights. Since the Russian breakthrough at the Triangle of Roads was flanked, the Soviet command decided to continue the offensive to the height. Until August 1st, the fighting became fiercer and fiercer. Freshly pulled up Russian forces managed to make a breakthrough in the northwestern section, but the resistance of the East Prussian Division did not allow them to advance further, and the 11th Division was emphasized in the summary of the Wehrmacht. It soon became clear that the Russian fighting orders were perfectly observable from Hill 43.3. When the 11th Division was replaced 20 days later by the 21st Division, it, with only 6 battalions, was able to repel the attacks of 6 to 7 Russian divisions. Its artillery fired 95,000 rounds, which is 2,315 tons of ammunition. These figures show how fierce the fighting was. The Silesians of the Mountain Rifle Division fought with the same steadfastness in the thinning forest near the Triangle of Roads, in the place where they had already distinguished themselves during the winter battles. At the same time, the 290th Division was fighting hard for the Wingler Bulge. In the first days of August, the Soviet command shifted the main blow to the eastern section of the front, between Voronov and the Kirov Railroad. The Russians attacked here from August 2nd to 4, with the forces of 29 battalions in order to break the German resistance at Sinyavinskaya Heights with a flank attack on MGA. Neither this nor the subsequent tank attack led to success in this area, where the 5th Mountain Rifle Division and the 1st Infantry Division held firm. Already in the first phase of the battle, the 18th Army engaged the 121st Division west of the Sinyavinskaya Heights. During the first third of August, the 126th Division, part of the 16th Army, replaced the 28th Airborne Division. The 58th Infantry Division von Grafen, withdrawn from the Leningrad front on July 23rd and 24, was already in the thick of the battle between Posolok No. 6 and the Neva River in the first days of August and launched a counteroffensive. Despite being supported by the massive fire of its own artillery and several Tiger tanks, the fighting was heavy and bloody. The 154th Regiment under Colonel Behrend took the brunt of the heavy flanking fire from the opposite bank of the Neva. The Russians made full use of their technical superiority. On the narrow offensive strip of the 2nd Infantry Regiment, which had a width of 300 meters, only during the first hours of the offensive the Russians made 80 Salvos multi-barrel rocket launchers with 18 shells in each salvo. In addition, fired artillery, mortars and tanks. August 4th was the hardest day for the 58th Infantry Division. Such terrain markings as Coast Road, Caravan Road, Burma Road, Rangoon Station, Turning Triangle Power Line, and the like are forever etched in the memories of those who were participants in those events. In the defense, counterattacks and counteroffensives, battles raged over bomb craters filled with water, over split tree trunks under Posolok No. 6, on the Triangle of Roads, on the Bermanskaya Road, and also on the Moika. The Russians had an enormous amount of ammunition, their aviation raided day and night, and the weakened forces of the German air units could not resist these attacks. During all this annihilating fire, infantry offensives ceased for a few days, but then they resumed with even greater vigor from August 12th to 23. The Soviet command threw 7 new divisions into the battle. In addition to the 21st and 254th Infantry Divisions, the Army now employed the 61st Infantry Division, which on August 18th was replaced for the last time at Karishi by the 132nd Infantry Division, after which it was trucked to the XXVI Army Corps. Its area of deployment was the 126th Infantry Division section near settlement No. 6 and the Turned Triangle, where it immediately engaged in heavy defensive fighting. In mid-October, as the fighting gradually began to subside, the 176th Infantry Regiment Cole. Weber took the place of the 215th Infantry Division on the left of this area, which had been withdrawn from the front. The battle gradually began to subside after August 24th, and the Soviet troops, in order for them to occupy a small area northwest of Voronov, had to put all their forces, both men and equipment, into the battle in vain. The 18th Army, during the Third Battle on Lake Ladoga, again achieved complete defensive success. Of course, this time too, the use of mixed formations and units on the battlefield could not be avoided, but in general the divisional commanders still fought with their own units. The army made sure that the change of divisions took place in a timely manner, which avoided a lot of bloody fighting, although the losses were still quite high. How heavy the fighting was is also shown by the fact that with very heavy losses in manpower, the number of Russian prisoners was not high. Once again, the German soldiery proved to be able to withstand the outnumbered enemy forces until the balance of power became too unfavourable for the German units. The Russian command failed to harmonise its offensive operations in the north and east, thus putting the German command in a difficult position. Unexpected decisions and plans for fighting in the Third Battle of Ladoga on the same battlefield were no longer possible. When, a few weeks later, the XXXX Soviet Guards Corps, which had received replenishment, abandoned its more serious objectives and once again attacked the Sinyavinskaya heights, it could not change anything in the course of the battle as a whole or affect its outcome. On September 24th, attacks and counterattacks again took place on the height, after which the monotonous routine of positional warfare began here as well. On October 2nd, the 290th Infantry Division finally abandoned the Wingler Bulge, as further fighting in this area was fraught with heavy unnecessary losses. This frontal ledge, so named after the prominent commander of the 366th Regiment Cole. Wingler proved to be a most inferior position, a death hole of swamps and split tree trunks, causing the area to lose its importance for fighting. Everyone, from the company commander to the commander of the army group, were unanimous in the fact that it should have been abandoned long ago, but Hitler rejected all suggestions made to him in this regard as defeatist, until the Russians did not force the German units to leave it. Connections XXVI Army Corps again showed themselves with the best side. Here fought 5 East Prussian divisions, of which the 1st and 11th Divisions were noted in the summary of the Wehrmacht, as well as the 5th Mountain Division, whose Bavarian-Austrian replenishment came here from the most remote areas of the Reich. Mention should also be made of the formations that were not organically connected with the divisions, such corps units as the artillery of the reserve of the High Command and brigades of rocket mortars, communications troops, numerically weak tank units and self-propelled artillery, tireless sanitary units and supply units. Not the least should also be said about the anti-aircraft artillery batteries, which fighting ground battles on the front line helped their comrades from the ground units to repel tank and infantry attacks of the enemy and destroy Russian aircraft about the weak aviation units, giving their last strength in the unequal struggle with the more powerful Russian aviation. Steadfastly and unwaveringly fought the 18th Army at the beginning of the 5th year of the war in the area it had held since the winter of 1941/42, and carried out its tasks in the area between the Volkhov, the Neva and the Gulf of Finland, including the blockade of Leningrad. The army group and the army itself, however, did not feel great joy at their defensive successes. All were aware that these successful battles before Leningrad would be the last if they had to continue to give their forces to other fronts. Even if, in accordance with Hitler's secret orders, each service was to know only what was directly relevant to the fulfillment of its tasks in certain battles, all higher headquarters could see the general situation developing on the Eastern Front and have their own judgment about it. In the months after the battle, more and more divisions had to be given to other army groups, to other fronts, without counting on replenishment even in the most crisis situations. In October and November, the following divisions were withdrawn from the 18th Army, the 58th, 69th, 290th, 81st, 132nd, and 23rd Infantry Divisions, as well as the 5th Mountain Division, which redeployed to Italy. The command of the I Corps, which had fought steadfastly for several years on the Volkhov, was transferred to the 16th Army. By the end of the year, it was envisaged to transfer 3 more divisions. In addition, for political reasons, as well as due to the enemy's advance in the west, an order was given to transfer the 250th Spanish Division to its homeland. Only the Spanish Legion volunteers with one regiment remained, but even this unit was given to the 121st Division until it was sent to Spain for the same reasons in March 1944. The Spanish volunteers of the Blue Division and the Spanish Legion, convinced of the necessity of Europe's struggle against Bolshevism, whose bloody handshake they had once felt in their own country, fought bravely and selflessly on the Volkhov, at Sinyavin, Krasny Bor and Pushkin. The Spanish losses amounted to about 13,000 men, of whom nearly 4,000 were killed, and among them 153 officers. A little over 300 were considered missing. The Spanish were considered by the Russians to be particularly dangerous opponents in close combat. The Army Group and the 18th Army expected a large-scale Russian winter offensive at the usual time, namely in January 1944, and knew that with severely thin divisions it would be impossible to hold the fronts on the Volkhov, in the Pogostievskoye cauldron, near Sinyavino, and in front of Leningrad and Oranienbaum. In this regard, their command requested permission for a timely withdrawal to rear positions fortified in accordance with the plan in order to occupy these positions without losses in manpower and equipment, which would allow them to hold them with the forces that were at their disposal. For this purpose, they equipped the rear position Panther, which ran approximately along the border of the Soviet Union with the Baltic states in 1939, i.e., on both sides of Lake Peipsy and on the Narva River. Thus, the reinforcement of rear positions did not begin until the summer of 1944. Before surrendering the exhausting bridgehead near Karishi and the Champagne-Cork area, which had already lost its importance, a 14.5-kilometer position near Kuzinka was strengthened, for which 8 engineer battalions were used. It ran in an arc from the mouth of the Tugoda River to the eastern edge of the Pogostievskoye cauldron and consisted partly of trenches and partly, where the terrain required it, of palisades. 192 dugouts and shelters for housing were built, and almost 8,000 mines were laid. In general, however, the necessary equipment and reinforcement of rear positions suffered here, as on all other parts of the front, from the fact that Hitler gave his consent too late, because he feared that such positions could, in his opinion, provoke the Army Group Command to a useless and unnecessary retreat. Immediately after the equipment of the Kaczynski position was finished, in the period from October 2nd to October 6th, were systematically, and without any interference from the enemy, were left Karishi bridgehead, over which there were heated arguments, swampy terrain, champagne corks. Unfortunately, the units that were saved were not given to the 18th Army, but were transferred to other fronts. The Soviet command could not notice the withdrawal of German troops in time, and only after a powerful fire preparation, the Russians took the positions abandoned by the German units, and their military summary of this operation was described as a great offensive cess, accompanied by the capture of a huge number of trophies, in addition, reported data on losses. After the German units left Karishi and the Champagne-Cork area, the Russians, assuming that a larger German retreat would soon begin, launched an offensive with powerful forces both at the Kusa position and on the Volkhov south of the breakthrough at Tugoda. Fighting took place from October 6th to October 15th. The 96th Division stationed here repelled all attacks or stopped the breakthroughs with counterattacks using its own forces. Especially fierce were the battles at Lesno, where Major Lorenz with the 287th Regiment and the 174th Infantry Regiment of the 81st Infantry Division drove back the enemy, namely an elite brigade of Russians. On the southern outskirts of the Pogostievskoye cauldron, at the mountain near Lubania, where the infirmary was located, the enemy, having made several attacks, tried to ascertain the situation. At the same time, it was necessary to repel repeated Russian attacks between Sinyavin and the Neva. The remaining rear positions were equipped with a cut-off position on both sides of the MGA with 47 kilometers of trenches and palisade positions, as well as anti-tank ditches and escarpments. The 1872 defensive structures and dugouts were to provide the troops with protection from enemy fire and bad weather. However, the troops held this position for only a few days, as the situation changed dramatically. To the north of Chudovo there appeared a highway position 75 kilometers long, which was adjacent to the rear position around the village and went towards the enemy along the road and railway Chudovo-Luban-Tosno-Sablino. It was a real cut-off position, but it was located in such a way that being in this position would mean giving up the isolation of Leningrad. During the retreats in January 1944, this position only temporarily played a role. The equipment of the other rear positions was unfinished, except for one cut-off position which ran north of the stronghold under construction near Novgorod and was to be adjacent to the planned Ordechskaya position there. Several sections north of Krasnogvardisk and south of the Iranian Balm bridgehead and further west of the Volkhov River in the area around Luga and Narva were also under construction. The construction of all other positions in Ordesh, Izhora, Luga, etc. remained only on paper for the construction of the other positions. Remained only on paper, there was no time for the real equipment of these positions. The 18th Army and Army Group constantly insisted on a timely retreat, but they did not receive permission to do so. Along with Hitler's principled prohibition of independent withdrawal operations, a significant role was played by the position of Finland, which caused concern to the German command. Since 1939, this brave small nation had suffered many bloody sacrifices in the war against the Soviet Union. The task of encircling Leningrad deprived the leadership of this country of the last confidence in the successful conclusion of the war in the East and encouraged him to seek any acceptable political way out of this war. Hitler, therefore, demanded from Army Group North and the 18th Army to perform what was impossible to do with the lack of forces and without a reserve. This task placed a heavy burden on the state of mind of both commanders of the 16th and 18th Armies and their staff officers, who felt the approach of a great disaster, and yet could not prevent it. Their departure from their posts would also have changed nothing, since their successors would have been given the same task without having any idea of the general situation and the situation of the troops. All supply depots, supply services, and army transports were withdrawn behind the defence line in order to make the troops more mobile and avoid probable losses in equipment. This was all that could be done. The German divisions once again celebrated Christmas at their positions on the Volkhov, in the Pogostievsky cauldron, on the Neva, near Leningrad, and in front of the Iranian Balm bridgehead. Anyone who could look back at the overall situation realized that these celebrations at these positions were for the last time the troops, overwhelmed with anxiety and concern, were saying goodbye to the old year, even though they had made some defensive gains that year. The year 1944 began for the Northern Front with quite a few worries. In the first week of January, it was again necessary to transfer the Volkhov divisions to other army groups, the 1st and 96th Infantry Divisions, which had been fighting in the area since the summer of 1941, as well as the 254th Division, which had been fighting here since the fall of 1941, albeit with minor interruptions. The threatening situation in the south, where the Soviet troops broke the front between army groups south and centre, fierce fighting in the area of deployment of the 16th Army south of Lake Ilmen, the onslaught of the Allied forces in Italy, guerrilla warfare in the Balkans. All these facts said that the 18th Army could no longer count on the supply of sufficient reserves from other areas. It was obvious only that the Russians would begin the offensive at the usual time, namely in mid-January, and everyone was also sure that the front of the army, weakened by the removal of several divisions from it, will not be able to withstand this offensive. The troops were also confident that Hitler would not authorize a timely organized retreat. Quite a lot of certainties, but unfortunately negative. In this situation it was necessary, therefore, to set ourselves up to fight our way back according to the rules imposed by the enemy, while trying somehow to regulate the pace of the retreat ourselves. All in all, a thankless task for a command that had no reserves or rear positions other than the front-line highway position and rear positions south of the Leningrad front. From the very beginning of the march eastward, the tragedy of Army Group North, and thus of the 18th Army, was that it received a combat assignment of important political significance, which it had to fulfill without having some sufficient forces to do so. These words were written in the military diary of the Army Group, but was not this in general a tragedy and all the armed forces of the great German Reich? After the 1st, 96th and 254th Divisions left the Volkhov area in the first week of January, the front of the 18th Army was arranged as follows. Starting from Lake Ilmen near Novgorod was XXXVII Corps, consisting of the 1st Luftwaffe Field Division, the 28th Airborne Division, and the 2nd Latvian SS Brigade, on the Middle Volkhov River up to Tugoda and further through the Pogostievsky cauldron, adjoined the shortened front XXV, III Corps as consisting of the 13th Field Division of the Luftwaffe, 21st Infantry Division and SS Division Polizei. On the Volkhov, 12th Field Division of the Luftwaffe and 121st Infantry Division, which was attached to the Spanish Legion forces of 1 regiment, in the Pogostievsky cauldron. The front on the MGA from Maluksa to the area west of Sinyavino was defended by the XXVI Corps, consisting of the 212th, 227th and 61st Infantry Divisions. Since January 11th, the latter was redeployed to Krasnogvardisk, where it became the Army Reserve. On the last section of the front stood the Liv Corps with the 225th, 24th and 11th Infantry Divisions on the Neva River and on both sides of the Izhora River to Pushkin. The Leningrad front from Pushkin to Yuritsk and Peterhof was held by the L Corps, with the 215th, 170th and 126th Infantry Divisions. At the Oranienbaum bridgehead was the ISS Corps with the 9th and 10th Field Divisions of the Luftwaffe and parts of the SS Nordland and Nederland. 21 divisions, some of which could only conditionally be called combat-ready, were now to defend the positions, which until the fall were held by 31 divisions by an incredible strain of strength. Thus was crossed the boundary of the possible, but before the illusions and stubbornness of Hitler and the resulting demands of his military commanders in the highest levels of command were powerless. For the last time stood here compounds in a more or less staffed composition necessary for combat operations. At the same time, individual regiments were assigned to other compounds, and the old Crimean divisions, which had 3 battalions in their regiments, had to hand them over to the Luftwaffe field divisions, instead of distributing them to the divisions of the ground forces. The Soviet leadership drew up new plans for the decisive battle before the gates of Leningrad, which differed greatly from the previous ones. The main blows were to be struck on both outer flanks of the Volkhov-Leningrad area. If this offensive ends successfully, the entire defense of the 18th Army collapsed, and at the most favourable outcome of the operation, all equipment and personnel of the German troops could be surrounded and destroyed. One offensive with the purpose of coverage began near Novgorod and took place simultaneously with the long-standing offensive on the 16th Army. The other was carried out from the eastern section of the Oranienbaum bridgehead and from the western section of the Leningrad front itself near Pushkin. The Russians now took advantage of the time and opportunity previously lost and sought to annex this bridgehead. On other sections of the Volkhov front and around the Pogostievskoye cauldron, Soviet units had to first stiffen German units and remain in close proximity to the enemy. A secondary operation was carried out at MGA. Despite the fact that the Soviet command in the same period conducted an offensive along almost the entire front from the Black Sea to the Gulf of Finland, he managed to gather a very powerful force against the 18th Army. In the directions of the main strike, Russian divisions often had a front width of less than 1 kilometre, while the German divisions had to defend in areas 25 to 30 kilometres wide. This advantage, combined with the use of large units of artillery and rocket mortars, as well as superior air power, left the German troops no prospect of holding their front for Army Group North. And the 18th Army was by no means a secret that the Soviet troops were conducting preparatory operations before the offensive, but without adequate reserves, with almost no tank units and fighter aircraft, as well as with a meagre supply of ammunition. They were forced to simply wait for the approaching disaster, as all proposals for a timely withdrawal of the front line were rejected by Hitler. January 15th, 1944 was a fateful day for the German front between the Volkhov and Leningrad. The coordinated attacks of the Soviet troops near Novgorod and from the eastern part of the Oranienbaum bridgehead on January 14th marked the beginning of the battle, designated in the combat calendar of the 18th Army as the defensive Battle of Novgorod and Leningrad, and the fighting during the withdrawal to Pskov and Narva. In both areas, the first blow was struck at the Luftwaffe field units, little trained in ground combat. Near Novgorod was located 1st Field Division of the Luftwaffe, as well as the southern flank of the 28th Airborne Division, which soon had to conduct heavy defensive fighting. Here the 102nd Grenadier Regiment Cole, a pelt of the 24th Division, which came from the Leningrad front, was thrown into the battle as reinforcements, which helped to strengthen the front, albeit temporarily. The Cavalry Brigade Graf Salm, parts of the reserve field battalions and one Estonian and one Latvian battalion each, as well as a battalion of vacationers, were also used. The 1st Field Division of the Luftwaffe and batteries of 88mm anti-aircraft guns played a significant role in the defence. On January 17th and 18, the Russians launched a series of tank attacks. On January 19th, the Russians with their northern offensive wedge reached the Novgorod-Luga railroad, while their southern wedge was approaching the road to Luga. Thus, 8 kilometers from Novgorod, the encirclement ring around it was about to close. North of Novgorod, the front on a stretch of about 20 kilometers wide was broken. The southern flank of the Silesian paratrooper units fought in the deep snow of the swampy forest area east of Zamoshi. In order to avoid destruction of the combat group in the Novgorod cauldron, it was ordered to break through to the west on the night of January 19th to 20th. In the course of heavy close fighting, often with only hand grenades and bayonets, the group managed to make the breakthrough, despite the anxious moments when they had to pick up the wounded. Only those who were no longer transportable were gathered in one place and cared for by staff physician Dr. Thiessen and sanitary Oberfeldwebel Maurer, who had volunteered to remain with them, were taken prisoner. The confidence of the commanders, reckless courage and discipline helped them to cope with the dire situation, though not without casualties. The ruins of Novgorod, once a major trading centre, were left behind. The capture of the city in 1941 was made at the beginning of the fighting for the Volkhov district. Its loss symbolically occurred at the beginning of the end of the 900-day struggle for Leningrad. What reached the territory free of enemy troops on January 20th turned out to be a motley crowd of battle-weary soldiers who needed to regroup first. Surprisingly, the Russians, who had experienced the powerful blows of German units during the fighting, did not immediately pursue the retreating troops. On both sides of Volkhov, Colonel Apelt 102nd Grenadier Regiment even managed to build a new line of defence before the enemy again continued the offensive. In the course of further fighting, the remnants of the 1st Luftwaffe Field Division were incorporated into the 28th Airborne Division, to which the 102nd Grenadier Regiment was temporarily transferred. Simultaneously with the offensive battles near Novgorod, Soviet units on January 14th went on the offensive from the eastern side of the Iranian bomb bridgehead, striking at the 9th and 10th Luftwaffe divisions, as a result of which the front edge of the German defence was broken through in some places. On the morning of January 15th at 7:20, a hurricane fire of thousands of Russian guns, mortars of all calibers on all German positions and rear areas, announced the beginning of the decisive battle for Leningrad. An hour later, a massive offensive of Soviet rifle and tank divisions began. Attack planes and bombers appeared out of the smoke of the fire rampart, dropped their deadly cargo and simultaneously shelled the area from on-board weapons. Batteries of heavy artillery and ship guns shelled the rear areas. Along the Gulf of Finland were located the 126th, 170th, 215th and 24th Infantry Divisions. The first main attack was made on the two middle divisions, while the 126th and 24th Divisions managed to repel the Russian attacks that sought to hold the German units together. By midday, the position of the 170th Division became critical. The enemy, having made a breakthrough, advanced its main forces deep into the defence for several kilometres. In the battle for the front edge of the defence, in the 391st Grenadier Regiment, Colonel Arndt killed both battalion commanders, Captains Moller and Meyer. 399th Grenadier Regiment was still holding on when the Russians broke through to the height where the command post of the regiment was located. During this and the difficult days that followed, the courageous commander of the 399th Regiment, Colonel Griesbach, was the soul of all his units in the defence. He united several other formations under his command, and in the course of the fighting he succeeded in leading the soldiers to Narva. The 126th Division under Colonel Fischer, which had already given its rifle battalion to the units at the Iranian bomb cauldron, was also forced to give the 170th Division its last reserves, namely, at the 2nd Battalion of the 422nd Grenadier Regiment, Captain Gograbe, and a battalion formed from 3 separate companies and commanded by Captain Grun. Rifles and other units of the 215th Division were also thrown into the battle hell of the 170th Division. The 32nd Grenadier Regiment of the 24th Division occupied the right flank of the 390th Regiment in order to put the units there out of harm's way. Sapper units of the 11th and 215th Divisions, the 938th Guard Battalion, rifle companies covering artillery positions, and temporary combat formations were already thrown into action on the first day to stop the Russian breakthrough. The mixing of units began again, which destroyed the regular composition of the formations, which had been restored after reaching Narva, and also complicated the command and supply of units. Despite the fact that the disparate units found themselves under the command of alien commanders, they showed incredible bravery and remained faithful to duty. Soldiers of all ranks steadfastly fought and died in the fulfillment of their duty. At dawn on January 16th, the battle began again with hurricane fire from the barrels of all calibers. The main blow, as before, was made on the 170th Division and the northern flank of the 215th Division, as well as the 380th Grenadier Regiment. Artillery observation posts reported enemy reserve units pulling up in columns of 4,000 to 5,000 men with 80 to 100 tanks, but still out of range of German artillery. The Soviet units advanced as far as the eastern outskirts of Krasnoye Selo. The 61st Division was forced to turn its 151st Grenadier Regiment with its front to the east into the command of the 170th Division. With the front to the west and northwest, the main units of the division fought alongside the Luftwaffe's 10th Field Division. The commander of the 162nd Regiment, Colonel Bosenberg, and the commanders of the other 2 regiments, 151st and 176th, were killed immediately in the first days of fighting. Brutal battles were fought for every village, every height. The Russian tanks were destroyed in close combat or by the fire of artillery, tank fighter units, and the fire of batteries of 88mm anti-aircraft guns. The command was constantly asking for support to keep the front under heavy attack. Divisions were still standing on the Volkhov at the Pogostivsky cauldron, and at the MGA Bend, while Russian breakthroughs west of Novgorod and south of Leningrad threatened their rear communications. The 11th Division was hastily withdrawn from its winter positions and thrown into the battle for Pushkin and Krasnoye Selo. Individual battalions and companies, supply units and temporary combat formations fought here and there, passing into the command of other divisions. During these battles, the northern flank of the 126th Infantry Division and the Luftwaffe's 9th Field Division still stood at the Gulf of Finland between Yuritskoye and the Oranienbaum bridgehead, with their defence line under serious threat from the Russians. The 215th Division still held Pushkin. Only on the night of January 18th to 19th came the order to withdraw from the positions, which created significant difficulties in the ever-narrowing area of retreat. Valuable combat equipment, including heavy siege artillery, had to be blown up and left in positions. On the same day that the German units left the ruins of Novgorod, the artillery observation posts also abandoned the last heights from which the towers, factory chimneys, and harbour cranes could be seen, and from which fire on Leningrad could be corrected. The Soviet Leningrad front established a ground connection with the Oranienbaum bridgehead to a depth of 20 kilometers. There was no doubt that the last days of the 900-day struggle for Leningrad were coming to an end. The inner flanks of the L Corps and ISS Corps were forced to withdraw to the south. The 170th and 126th Divisions left Krasnoye Selo. The 11th Division fought east of Krasnovardesk, while the 61st Division fought west of Kipenia, adjacent to the 10th Luftwaffe Division. On the night of January 19th to 20th, the 126th Division, which was surrounded, managed, together with parts of the 9th Luftwaffe Field Division and scattered units of other formations, to make a breakthrough to the south, under the command of Colonel Fischer. In these days the weather was unstable. Cold, snowfall and thaw alternated each other. The soldiers were tormented by damp-soaked shoes and winter clothes, from lack of sleep, from the lack of hot food and appropriate shelter. The roads were crowded with wagons, equipment and vehicles, with the wounded mixed with columns of refugees who had left their homes, among them many who no longer wanted to stay under the Bolshevik regime. Soviet fighter bombers were constantly circling in the air, dropping their deadly cargo on the vehicles, and the soldiers saw pictures that they had never seen on the northern front during the entire time of fighting between Volkhov and Leningrad. In the rear of their own front there were cases of flight and panic, all sorts of rumours spread with lightning speed, but where the wagons and columns were led by experienced and energetic commanders, calm remained. After the Russians launched an offensive on the southern flank of the Pogostivskoe cauldron in the area of the 121st Division, the units of the 18th Army, located between the Volkhov and the Neva, retreated on January 20th to 22nd, according to the order to the highway position, north of the road Chudovo-Luban-Sablino, without any obstacles from the enemy. It made no sense to stay in the Pogostivskoye cauldron and at the MGA bend. Besides, the command wanted to release some units. On January 22nd, by evening the situation in the area of the 18th Army was as follows. On the southern flank, Fort Speth's battle group XXXVII Corp 18 kilometers west of Novgorod. On the roadless swampy terrain 20 kilometers northwest of Novgorod the situation was unclear. Schultz's battle group 28th Airborne Division withdrew its southern flank west of the swamps near Zamoshi, that is, approximately along the front line of the Russian Volkhov cauldron of 1942. The SS Polizei Division, freed by the reduction of the front line, marched from the Chudovo-Babino area along snowy forest roads in a southwestern direction to Ordesh to join XXVII Corps. From XXVII Corps on the Volkhov River stood still the 13th Luftwaffe Field Division and the 21st Infantry Division east of Chudovo, the left flank of the 21st Division, the 12th Luftwaffe Field Division, and the 121st Division. The 212th and 24th Infantry Divisions without the 102nd Grenadier Regiment occupied a highway position about 5 to 10 kilometers from the Chudovo-Sablino road. The entire area of Vanyagolov, Karbusel, Sinyavin, MGA and Otradnoy, for which fierce fighting had been fought, was abandoned. The 225th and 227th Divisions were withdrawn from the front and hastily redeployed westward to the area of Krasnogvardisk and west of it, where the situation was becoming more dangerous by the hour, as the Russians in some areas were already approaching the highway and railroad Krasnogvardisk. Orlosovo. Of the Liv Corps on the southern Leningrad front, the 24th Division and the right flank of the 215th Division stood on the eastern outskirts of Sablin, south of Krasnoy Bor and north of Pushkin, occupying their old positions. The 11th Division withdrew to the area north of Krasnogvardisk, where the fighting Griesbach's group of the 170th Division was fighting. There the front ended. In some areas were defensive fighting separate battle groups of the 126th and 61st Divisions, holding back the strong Russian onslaught, clinging to every settlement, settling in the forests and on occupied heights. The main part of the 170th Division was retreating with fighting west of Volosov in the direction of Yamburg and Narva. The 9th and 10th Luftwaffe Divisions had already lost their importance as combat units, which was not the fault of the soldiers themselves, who fought bravely on the battlefield, but the senseless organization and insufficient training of these formations. On January 23rd, the Russians reached the highway and railroad Krasnogvardisk-Volosovo. Thus the Leningrad front of the retreating German units was broken here, and the Russians took possession of the territory with the best road network. As before, one hotbed of battles was the area west of Novgorod, where the enemy continued to advance south of the city and on the northern flank of the 16th Army reached the western shore of Lake Ilmen. These operations created a threatening gap between both armies, causing great concern in the army group. Another hotbed of fighting was the area near the Krasnogvardisk-Volosovo-Yamburg road. In both hotbeds fought divisions no longer in full strength, but only in the form of separate battle groups of different compounds, which greatly complicated the unified command. Especially fierce were the battles for the railroad junction Krasnogvardisk, which in addition was firing shipboard artillery from Kronstadt. On the night of January 25th to 26th, the Russians took possession of this point, with which for a long time for many vacationers was connected the beginning and the end of their vacation at home. On the night of January 23rd to 24th, the 24th and 215th Divisions were finally ordered to retreat from their positions at Sablin. The 24th Division, with all its subordinate headquarters and units, managed only to break away from the enemy with a fight. often, in order to maintain the cohesion of units, had to counterattack to reflect the Russian breakthrough. And here we should note the prudence and skill of the commander of the commander of the 32nd Regiment, Colonel Opelt, who distinguished himself in these battles. After a short stay on the highway position, the division, despite the threatening situation on the left flank, reached the line Stekolny-Novolosino station by the evening of January 25th. The Rifle Battalion and a battalion of the 454th Regiment suffered particularly heavy losses. On January 27th, General Versok took with his units a circular defence. On his right there was still communication with the 212th Division, but on the left with the 215th Division communication was interrupted. When on January 24th the 215th Infantry Division was forced to abandon its positions near Pushkin, the Dudagov Hill, Krasnoye Selo and Krasnovardisk were already in Russian hands. Behind them the fires of recaptured villages were burning. Pushkin was burning on all sides. The left flank was suspended in the air, and the way through the Izyora position had to be first reclaimed with fighting. On January 26th Tsaritsa was reached, where a large jam was formed because of the columns. The Russians continued the pursuit. One strike group only with great difficulty managed to leave the command post of the XVI Army Corps. Assessment of the situation, decision-making and giving orders to the Corps Pole commander, who while still commander of the 1st Division received oak leaves to the Knight's Cross, was undoubtedly dictated by the situation, when he gave the order to leave Vyritsa the next night, having previously ordered the destruction of a large number of vehicles and equipment. Thus, on January 27th began a grueling withdrawal of foot units south along the railroad embankment, while columns of vehicles moved through Severskaya. On the morning of January 28th, many tired soldiers were able to leave in the unheated cars of 3 freight trains. In the crowded cars, Swabian soldiers sang in a hoarse voice a song about their homeland on the Swabian Railroad. On January 26th, the situation deteriorated further. Because of the disintegration of compounds and communication breakdown, became impossible to unified command of troops. The onslaught of the enemy, primarily on both flanks of the army, unfavourable conditions of the terrain, where there was practically no road communication, led to the fact that the troops began to be divided into separate combat groups with different composition and combat effectiveness. Very large were the losses among commanders and officers, whose personal example to some extent contributed to the cohesion of soldiers. There were divisions in which all commanders of grenadier regiments and most battalion commanders were killed. There were also infantry divisions that numbered only 500 men. From the wagons and columns of fighters could no longer be taken. By the evening of January 26th, the situation was as follows. On both sides of the railroad Novgorod-Luga, about 30 kilometers west and northwest of Novgorod stood, in defense XXXVI Corps with battle groups Polya, Shpet and Bok 40 kilometers southeast of Luga and on the western edge of the stretched swampy terrain. North of Volnaya Gorka, a gap was formed. From the XXVI Corps on both sides of Novaya Keresti stood front to the South Schultz Battle Group, 28th Airborne Division. In the semicircle around Chudov still stood the 13th Luftwaffe Field Division, the 21st Infantry Division and the 12th Luftwaffe Field Division on the former line Spasskaya Polist-Gruzino up to the area east of Lubani. The 121st Division fought on both sides of Luban north of the highway. XXVI Corps left Ushaki, Tosno and Sablino. In addition, a gap was formed in the direction of XVI Corps, which fought defensive battles with the forces of the 212th, 24th and 215th Divisions in the swampy forests near Vyritsa. L Corps was retreating with battles to the south on both sides of the road Krasnovardisk-Luga. Its 11th and 126th Divisions stood in defence north of Severskaya, where the 12th Panzer Division came up from the south. West of Severskaya the whole army was scattered. Between the roads from Krasnovardisk westward to Yamburg and southward to Luga, there were no other roads in the right direction. The 18th Army now consisted of the main eastern group, which was retreating from the east, northeast and north toward Luga, and the western group, which was split into unconnected small battle groups and was trying to fight its way west toward Narva. The gap between the main eastern group and the western group was getting larger and larger. On the evening of January 26th, the Western Group was still fighting for Volosovo with the forces of Sponheimer's battle group, which in turn consisted of battle groups and remnants of the 61st Division. The two Luftwaffe field divisions 9th and 10th were no longer combat formations as such. The IIISS Corps stood with its Nordland and Nederland units mostly still in their old positions on the western edge of the former Oranienbaum bridgehead. During these days the thaw stopped and frost came again. For the units that stood near Chudov and near the highway, whose forward echelons had moved far ahead, which was quite dangerous, it was also time to withdraw. Here the enemy did not push particularly hard, because in this section of the German units had to retreat themselves or could be surrounded. The movement began on the night of January 27th to 28th. During January 28th, the army units became even more dispersed. Between the flanks of the 16th and 18th armies formed a dangerous gap, front to the south, about 40 kilometers southeast of Luga, on both sides of the road Luga-Shimsk on Lake Ilmen, held the defense of the southern flank of XXXVIII Corps. Speths and Box battle groups fought with the front to the east in a small area, but despite this, lost contact with each other. Schultz XXVIII Corps battle group was still positioned on either side of Novgorod. The 21st Division was withdrawn from the front and sent on a march to the southwest. The 13th Luftwaffe Division still stood near Chudov, the 12th Luftwaffe Division near the highway, and the 121st Infantry Division on both sides of Luben with the front to the north. From here a 50-kilometer wide gap was formed in the swampy forest terrain of the former Volkhov cauldron and stretched to Novinka near the railroad Leningrad-Vyritsa-Oridesh Nevel, where the 24th Division stood in defense with a 20-kilometer front. To the east, this division distinguished itself in the fierce fighting at Krasny Bor and served as a support and backup for both its own and neighboring units. In the area of Lisin, the retreating corps units of the 212th Division joined the 24th Division. At the highway and the railway Krasnovardirsk-Luga retreated marching remnants of the 212th and 215th Divisions 15 to 20 kilometers south of Severskaya. They were covered by the 11th and 126th Divisions, which were still fighting defensive battles north of Severskaya. In the settlement itself stood the 12th Panzer Division. This was the vacant western flank of the main, eastern group of the army, which no longer had any connection with the western group. Soviet units of unknown strength were making their way forward through roadless, wooded terrain to Osmino, located halfway between Luga and Yamburg. From the western group, from Sponheimer's group with the IIISS Corps attached to it, the Berlin Battle Group, remnants of the 227th 61st Divisions, and parts of the 225th Division were fighting rearguard action near the railroad halfway between Volosovo and Yamburg-Kingiseppek. East of Yamburg also retreated with fighting Wedel Battle Group, remnants of the 170th Infantry Division and the 10th Field Division of the Luftwaffe with parts of the SS Nordland and Nederland. Along the two roads in the coastal area, the rearguard of the SS formations were retreating towards Narva. All the histories of the divisions are marked by many outstanding deeds of brave commanders, and the units themselves steadfastness, decisive counterattacks and comradely assistance to neighbouring units. A detailed description of all the actions would require expanding the scope of this book, but in order to create a true picture of the events of that incredibly difficult period of time, it is impossible not to say that during the retreat of the soldiers from mental and physical overload of mental and physical nerves and strength failed, that on the roads on which they had to retreat, before them opened terrible pictures. An accurate representation of the events of those days can be obtained if you combine light and darkness, amazing deeds, on the one hand, and the horror of the whole war on the other. On the night of January 28th to 29th, the troops finally left the Chudovo-Luben area and retreated to the southwest. In order to have more or less reliable cover in the gap between the main group and the western group, the 215th Division turned west to Osmino 50 kilometers northwest of Luga. There its forward units under Lieutenant Colonel Gerdbrink encountered large enemy tank units whose main supply route passed through this village. These were the Russian units that had begun pursuing the German troops through the vast wooded terrain and posed quite a threat to the retreating troops. The path of advance of the 215th Division became at the same time a front line in a northern and western direction against Russian infantry and tanks, and in a southern direction against partisan units. In this area were located command posts, firing positions and locations of artillery and heavy weapons traction. In addition, there was a road through which the supply of troops. Resistance here brought a gain in time of 3 days, which allowed other units to pull up here and create a new line of defence near Ladoga, which in those days was very important. All these actions of the 215th Division were justly reflected in the reports of the Wehrmacht and became an example for many other units in that difficult and even unpromising situation of heavy retreat. These battles differed from the battles of previous years for command posts, fields strewn with bomb craters, trench plots, for forest edges and ruins of villages, for a few hundred meters of land. The skill of commanders of all ranks, the combat readiness and steadfastness of the troops deserve the highest recognition here. January 30th was surrendered Severskaya, where almost all this time was the command post of the 18th Army. The next day the Western Group retreated from Yamburg. At the end of January 1944, the main group held the defence around Ladoga, viz. XXXVII Corps defended with a front to the south and southeast approximately 30 to 45 kilometers southeast of Ladoga with the battle groups of Karov, Polya and Speth. The 12th Panzer Division was advancing to the southeast, with the task of restoring communication with the 16th Army through the offensive. XXVII Corps stood on the front to the east and northeast about 50 kilometers east of Ladoga, consisting of the 21st and 121st Divisions, as well as the 12th and 13th Field Divisions of the Luftwaffe. L Corps occupied positions facing north approximately 30 to 40 kilometers north and northwest of Ladoga, consisting of the 24th, 11th, 126th, 212th, and 215th Divisions. The XXVI Corps Command had already been redeployed to new positions to fulfill new tasks. It should be mentioned here that all the divisions named no longer had the combat capability corresponding to the concept of division, as they had previously suffered more or less heavy losses in manpower and equipment. The situation of the units that withdrew from the Chudov area was the best. The Western Group Spondheimer concentrated its forces near Narva with the remnants of the 61st, 170th, 225th, and 227th Divisions, with the 9th and 10th Field Divisions of the Luftwaffe and parts of the SS Nordland and Nederland. Army Group North combined all these units into Army Group Narva and strengthened the defence of the area between Lake Pipsi and the Gulf of Finland. Soon it became clear that the Army Group's plans to hold the Ladoga area were not feasible. The main Army Group had to fight to regain the way of retreat to the position Panther south of Lake Pipsi. The 18th Army, having reached the Ladoga-Narva line, thus left the Volkhov district. 900 days of the struggle for Leningrad, which had begun with great hopes in August 1941, were coming to an end. If at the very beginning of the war Hitler unexpectedly refused to take Leningrad, which was quite feasible, now that everything was over, Army Group North was denied a timely retreat, which it had repeatedly requested. Outnumbered many times in strength, the enemy forced this retreat. According to the plans of the Soviet command, this retreat of the German troops should have led to the destruction of the 18th Army in a cauldron in the wooded and swampy area between the Volkhov, Leningrad and Ladoga. The fact that this catastrophe did not happen is entirely to the credit of commanders of all ranks who, despite the dangers and difficulties, showed their skill in the most difficult situations, and also to the credit of all units who showed unparalleled fortitude, perseverance, and a sense of camaraderie, and made the impossible possible. Everyone, ordinary infantrymen and riflemen, sappers and artillerymen, tankers and tank fighters, signalmen and medics, vehicle drivers, anti-aircraft gunners and flying personnel, SS soldiers and railroad workers, all Germans, Spaniards, Flemish, Dutch, Danes, Norwegians, Latvians and Estonians, as well as volunteers from the local population, did their best and made their sacrifices in doing so. Their struggle here in the north was not against the Russians as people, but against Bolshevism, which was a threat to the freedom of Western Europe. German troops were now leaving the area between the Volkhov, Lake Ladoga and the Gulf of Finland, where they had fought many successful battles, the last of which they had lost, but through no fault of their own. That is why they left the battlefield with their heads held high. That is why they found the strength to continue fighting in the Baltics for the next 14 months. They left behind many graves of their comrades who would soon disappear from the face of the earth. They also left behind many untransportable wounded, with whom doctors and orderlies voluntarily stayed. They left behind a relatively small number of prisoners, to whom the Soviet command had cut off the way of further retreat, and finally they left behind a lot of unnecessary military equipment, for the transportation of which there were neither good roads nor means of transportation. Here they also left a part of their heart, because everyone who fought at the Volkhov will never forget it, feeling proud of all the events and deeds of that time and cursing all the cruelty of the war and all that he was ordered to do.